In the years after the war, when New York rebuilt itself and the piers along the East River carried more freight than any port on the coast, the Fulton Fish Market stood as one of the oldest working engines in the city. Before most people turned on their radios in the morning, trucks were already reversing into the bays. Cutters were already sharpening knives, and buyers from restaurants all over Manhattan were counting cash in their pockets. Nothing about it looked modern. Nothing about it looked organized. But like every place where thousands of dollars moved before sunrise, someone eventually noticed that the right hands could guide the flow. Fish was not glamorous, was not the kind of business people argued about in bars, but it was steady, it was daily, and it was essential. And in a city where the cold chain depended on trucks, ice, timing, and the men who unloaded crates at 4 in the morning, whoever controlled those steps controlled the money. Not the storefronts, not the restaurants, the movement, the labor, the access. That was the opening. A quiet one, a practical one, the kind of opening that rewarded men who understood the value of routine. They did not need guns. They did not need headlines. They just needed the ground under the trucks and the people who decided who moved what. If you love stories about power, control, corruption, and quiet empires built in plain sight, make sure to follow, because this one ends where nobody expected it to. Lower Manhattan, early 1970s. Back then, the market ran on muscle and habit. Old sheds, wooden stalls, icy floors. Men with decades in their legs doing the same run every dawn. Most New Yorkers never saw it. They only saw the plate on the restaurant table. But the people who worked those piers knew a different truth. They knew that access to Fulton was as valuable as the fish itself. A truck that got a good spot could unload in minutes. A truck that got pushed to the side could sit for hours, losing freshness, losing buyers, losing profit. Timing was everything. Favor was everything. And favor rarely came free. The Genovese family had been near the waterfront since the 40s. Labor, unions, freight. The market was part of that world, even if nobody talked about it. But it did not turn into a fortress until one man stepped into the picture, a man who understood routine better than most. His name was Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, and during the years this story takes place, he was already considered one of the old hands. A calm figure, a patient type, the kind of man who never raised his voice but never needed to. He spent his younger years around card rooms and small clubs in East Harlem, doing simple jobs, watching how older men handled disputes without ever lifting a finger. He learned early that the city worked on relationships, not noise. By the time Salerno took a closer interest in the Fulton Fish Market, he was not a street-level worker anymore. But he still carried the habits he learned as a young man, sweeping floors in back rooms and doing odd jobs for bookmakers who paid attention to every detail. He remembered who showed up early, who counted cleanly, who never made excuses. He respected working men because he grew up around them. That familiarity mattered. A man like him did not appear to the dockworkers as a stranger. He looked like someone who understood what long nights and early mornings did to a person. That alone opened doors. The first step was not dramatic. It never is. It began with relationships. A few foremen, a few loaders, a few men who handled access to the unloading docks. At the time, the International Longshoremen's Association still had influence. There were old ties between some union officials and the Genovese crew around East Harlem. Nothing formal, nothing written. But enough to create a conversation about keeping things orderly. In a place like Fulton, order meant priority. Priority meant trucks moved on time. And trucks moving on time meant money every single day of the year. Salerno saw the real value immediately. The fish itself was not the target. The movement of the fish was if he could make sure certain wholesalers, certain distributors, and certain truck owners had predictable access, he could build a system that never needed force. All it needed was consistency. And consistency was something Salerno understood better than most men in his world. He started by talking to the men who handled the lists. In Fulton, the lists were everything. Which truck backed in first? Which crew unloaded? Which buyer got first look? A slight change in sequence could mean thousands of dollars gained or lost before breakfast. Salerno did not push his weight. He did not make threats. That was not his style. He asked simple questions. Were the crews paid on time? Were the unloading spots being used properly? Were certain trucks causing delays? He made himself sound concerned about the efficiency of the market. And the truth was, the men on the docks appreciated anyone who made their lives smoother. Before long, the crews began noticing the changes. Trucks belonging to favored distributors moved through faster. Disputes about placement disappeared. Buyers found that certain wholesalers always seemed ready first. None of it looked suspicious. It looked like the market tightening up the way any old institution does when someone with a good head steps in quietly. By the next year, Salerno's presence was felt in every corner of those early morning hours. He did not show up often, but when he did, men stopped talking for a moment out of respect. He was steady. He was polite. He asked about families. He remembered names. He treated the loaders and cutters like men who made the city run. That mattered in a place where most people only saw you for your labor. The envelopes began moving slowly at first. Small payments, nothing outrageous. A thank you from a wholesaler who appreciated the priority. A gesture from a truck owner who needed reliability to keep customers. Everyone understood that the money kept the market running smooth. Nobody called it extortion. Nobody needed to. In those years, the line between influence and necessity was thin, and Salerno walked it with the discipline of someone who built his life on staying calm. By the mid-70s, the system took shape. Not rushed, not forced. More like a structure grown from daily habit. The market ran on thousands of small transactions, and each one offered an opportunity for a man like Salerno to guide the flow with subtle pressure. A delay here, a favor there, a reminder that certain forms needed processing. A suggestion that the city inspectors visited more often when the lines were disorganized. Everything was simple, practical. The kind of influence older dock workers called the way things run. The wholesalers benefited first. Those who paid quietly got the best movement. Their fish hit the buyers early. Their trucks turned around fast. Restaurants liked dealing with them because their orders were fresher. Retailers appreciated the consistency. It was a cycle that fed itself. And each part of the cycle produced money that moved back toward the Genovese family without ever needing to make noise. Some men resisted at first. Always happens. A few independent distributors tried to handle their own placement. A few argued about the fees. A few thought they could wait out the pressure. But the market was unforgiving. A truck delayed by half an hour lost freshness. A buyer who waited too long went elsewhere. A distributor who missed a morning rush could lose a week's margin. No threats were needed. The city itself did the teaching. Salerno noticed something important during that period. The men who worked the piers were not concerned with politics or alliances. They were concerned with making their shift worth the hours. If a system made their work easier, they accepted it. If a man respected the time they put in, they respected him back. That was the core of his approach. He did not want fear. He wanted reliability. And reliability came from familiarity. By the late 70s, the Fulton fish market operated like a fortress. Not because armed guards stood at the gates, but because everyone inside understood that the routines were established and unshakable. Trucks moved in the same patterns. Envelopes moved in the same circles. Crews knew their roles. Wholesalers knew their costs. Buyers knew where to go. And behind the scenes, Salerno received reports with the calm of a man who had already seen enough years to know that quiet systems lasted longer than loud ones. He did not brag. He did not expand recklessly. He did not try to take more than the market could give. He kept the flow steady, the relationships clean, and the city inspectors satisfied with a market that always appeared orderly. To outsiders, it looked like an old New York institution running on tradition. To insiders, it was a structure guided by one man's understanding of routine and the Genovese family's confidence in his judgment. By the next season, his influence was no longer questioned. It was simply accepted, the way men accept sunrise after years of working before dawn. By the start of the 1980s, the Fulton fish market had become one of the most predictable parts of the city, even though the rest of New York was changing fast. Crime rose everywhere else. Stores closed earlier. Whole blocks turned over. But down at South Street, before the sun came up, the same trucks still lined the curbs. The same men still carried crates across the same icy floors. And the same names still held weight in the early hours. That consistency did not happen by accident. It came from a system that had been shaped quietly, piece by piece, until no one questioned how the order held. The wholesalers who paid their share stayed at the front of the line. Their fish always seemed to hit the buyers first. Their trucks moved through without delay. The crews unloading their shipments were the same every week, dependable men who knew exactly how to handle delicate orders. The distributors who resisted the system saw their trucks wait longer, sometimes without any clear reason. Their fish hit the floor later. Their buyers grew impatient. Snow, rain, heat, it did not matter. The market rewarded those who followed the rhythm Salerno set and punished those who tried to step out of it. Never with noise, never with force. Just small delays that drained profit. Salerno did not visit the market often, but the men working there talked about him like someone who understood them. Most remembered seeing him back in the 60s. Leaning near a loading bay, holding a cup of coffee, nodding at foremen who came by to check the list. He looked like someone who could have been a union delegate or a neighborhood shop owner. A steady presence. He asked simple questions. Who was working double shifts? Who needed more men? Who was taking advantage of the crews? Men remembered that. When someone who respects your work steps in, you don't forget it. Through those memories, his influence stayed strong even when he wasn't physically there. That was the mark of a man whose power came from reputation, not pressure. The Genovese family appreciated that kind of steadiness. In other parts of the city, younger men made noise, drew heat, and caused trouble. Salerno built systems that never needed attention. That reliability made him valuable in a world where too many operations depended on fear instead of function. As the market grew busier, a new challenge appeared. More restaurants, more wholesalers, more trucks, more money. And with more money came more eyes. City officials began asking questions about congestion. Reporters wrote about the aging infrastructure. Buyers complained about delays. Rumors surfaced about favoritism. Nothing public, nothing major, but enough to remind the family that the market could not stay untouched forever. Salerno handled it the way he handled everything else. Quietly, he encouraged the wholesalers to maintain clean paperwork. He made sure the crews followed basic safety rules to avoid unnecessary attention. He told the men in charge of collecting envelopes to keep the amounts steady, no surprises, no sudden increases. He avoided greed because he understood that greed broke systems long before outsiders did. Still, politics found its way into everything. City Hall wanted more oversight. There were talks about reorganizing the piers. Some advocated moving the market entirely. The waterfront was changing. Real estate developers saw the area as potential land for future projects. Salerno knew what that meant. When the city sees land differently, the old systems start to shake. But the market was not ready to fall apart. Not yet. There was too much money, too many relationships, too many years of quiet understanding. The Genovese family had a firm hold on the lists through trusted men who had been around long enough to understand the rules. These men were not flashy. They did not boast. They were the kind of workers who showed up every day at 3 in the morning because that was the life they knew. And they enforced the informal rules with nothing more than a look or a reminder that reputation mattered. By the next year, a new tension grew. Younger distributors, some backed by outside investors, wanted to push into the market. They had modern trucks. They offered quicker deals. They talked about efficiency. But they did not understand the traditions. They tried to negotiate unloading times the same way they negotiated business contracts. That never worked in Fulton. The men unloading crates had their own system, one built on familiarity and respect, not corporate language. Some of those younger distributors complained. They wrote to city officials. They suggested favoritism. They implied unfair practices. And once those complaints came in, inspectors began showing up more often. Not investigating mafia activity, they rarely said those words out loud, but looking at safety compliance, refrigeration temperatures, sanitation standards. Every inspection slowed down the day. Every slowdown threatened the flow. This was the beginning of the market's decline, though no one realized it yet. The power Salerno built depended on routine. When the city started interrupting that routine, even in small ways, the system began to wobble. Salerno understood the danger before most. He was older by then, more concerned with maintaining stability than expanding influence. He told his closest men to keep the operation lean. No unnecessary collections. No new fees. No pushing the wholesalers too hard. He had seen rackets collapse under the weight of ambition. He did not want the market to become another casualty. But he could not stop the changes outside his control. New federal laws targeted racketeering in labor unions. The longshoremen's influence weakened. Investigators looked into the corrupt elements of waterfront industries, not just at the piers, but all along the supply lines. When authorities examined one part of the waterfront, they eventually looked at all of it. Fulton was part of that world, even if it was quieter than most operations. Some say this period marked the start of Salerno's gradual step back from day-to-day decisions. Others say differently. Some former workers claim he stayed involved in broad terms, guiding the market from a distance while younger hands handled the lists and the envelopes. There is no single record of it. But the men who worked those years agree on one thing. His presence still held weight even when he was not physically there. Then came the question of relocation. The city debated moving the market to Hunts Point in the Bronx. Officials argued the old Fulton site was outdated, congested, and unsafe. The wholesalers fought the move at first, but the pressure grew. When markets relocate, the routines change. When routines change, influence weakens. Salerno knew that. Load piers protected his system. A new facility with modern oversight would not. By the early 90s, the plan was set. The market would move. And when it did, the entire structure Salerno had built, refined, and kept steady for decades began to dissolve. Hunts Point had stronger regulation, more eyes, more modern tracking. It was built for transparency, not tradition. Systems that ran on handshake agreements and quiet influence had no room there. When the Fulton Fish Market finally left South Street, it was the end of an era, not just for the vendors, but for the men who remembered what the place once represented. Salerno had already been convicted on federal charges by then. His influence on the market faded as new rules replaced old ones. He could not shape a system inside a modern facility the way he shaped one inside a century-old waterfront where routine mattered more than regulations. But the older men remembered. They remembered how the market ran when the city was different. They remembered how trucks used to line up before dawn and how certain names always got through first. They remembered the quiet system that kept the early morning chaos from turning into disorder. Some say the market functioned better back then. Others say differently. But everyone agrees that no one ever controlled the flow again the way Salerno did. By the end of that decade, his era was over. The new market in Hunts Point became a regulated environment with official schedules, city oversight, and documented procedures. The world changed. The rules changed. and the fortress Salerno helped shape became another chapter in the long history of New York's working markets. In the final years of his life, Salerno was no longer the man shaping early morning routines. He was a figure older workers talked about in quiet conversations, a reminder of a time when influence moved through simple gestures and steady hands. The market had moved on, but the stories remained. And the men who lived those years remembered the truth of it. In the end, the trucks kept coming, and the fish kept moving, but the fortress behind the flow belonged to another generation. The city took the piers, the regulations took the structure. But the memory of how it once worked stayed with the men who saw it firsthand. Men who knew that some systems needed no walls to be a fortress, only routine, discipline, and the right kind of quiet leadership.